Welcome to the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show. Presented by the Michigan Nursery and Landscape Association. Now here's your Garden Show host, Dr. Bob Schutzke.
Hello everyone. Welcome to the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show, brought to you by the Michigan Nursery and Landscape Association. I'm Dr. Bob, your host for the 2021 gardening season. Tune in every Saturday at 4 p.m. through August. We will share garden insights, feature guests from Michigan's green industry, and answer your questions submitted through PlantMichiganGreen.com Ask the Expert. Our hope is to make the most of your outdoor living experience. During the week, you can log on to PlantMichiganGreen.com, your landscaping and horticulture resource, to pose gardening questions, find a professional horticulturist, locate a retail garden center in your area, or become aware of the rewarding careers in Michigan's green industry. Today's show will be spent talking about right plant, right place. We will spend today's show talking about right plant, right place. So stick around and get into the gardening groove on the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show on News Talk 760 WJR. Welcome back. We're here today to talk about right plant, right place. In the last couple of weeks, both with Bert Craig and Stacy Hervella, we talked about right plant, right place, choosing a plant that's specific for your garden. And so today I would like to go into more details on right plant, right place, and really talk about how important it is when it comes to selecting plants for your landscapes. The first thing we think about when we're thinking about plant selection is function. What do you want the plant to do? How is it going to serve you in your landscape? How is it going to add to the complexion of your landscapes, to the aesthetics and that? So in many cases, when we think about function, we think about screening, borders, we think about blocking unwanted views, minimizing soil erosion, developing favorable microclimates. There's a whole bunch of things in function that comes to selecting the right plant. And so when you think about function, write down a list of what you want the plant to do for you, and that'll be a basis to start. The next thing we think about is aesthetics. Do I want spring, summer, fall, or winter ornamental appeal? And with each season comes specifics. For example, in spring it's usually flowers, but a lot of people often overlook the emerging new leaves because in many cases the fall color that you see in autumn comes out early in emerging leaves in spring. And for example, probably the best example of that is the red maple. When red maple leaves begin to emerge in spring, they're bright red. And as the sunlight hits the leaves and chlorophyll is developed, then they transition over to green. So when you're thinking about a plant for spring display, don't overlook the leaves because the emerging leaves can be an added attraction to that spring landscape. When it comes to summer, quite often we think about foliage, we think about fruit development, and in some cases, especially for the flowering shrubs that Stacy talked about last week, we think about flowers. And so again, when you think about that summer, what do you want to see or how do you want those plants to add to the attraction during your summertime? Fall, we think about, again, fall foliage. We think about fruit display. And in some cases, especially with interesting plants, like Heptacodium, seven sunflower. It actually blooms in the latter part of August, and the flowers last until fall. Also, the native plant, the common witch hazel, has yellow strap-like flowers in fall. So there may be a few plants that are unique in the fact that they're giving you a flower display when you least expect it. For winter, we think about branch color, we think about stem color, we think about bark characteristics. And again, there's many plants that offer interesting stem, bark, and branch characteristics that can lend to your winter landscape. Probably the next thing, and probably the most important thing overall, is what's available space that you have in your landscape. When you go to selecting a plant, one of the things to consider is how big the plant will get, or how much space that plant needs to develop. And the second, the counter to that, is how much space are you willing to give it. If the plant needs a lot more space than you're willing to give, then you're going to have to maintain or prune it to fit that particular space. And so when it comes to the available space, do I want the plant to do its own thing? Do I want it to maintain its natural shape? Or am I going to impose a cultivated or man-made shape on that particular plant in order to fit the space that I have? And there's a lot of examples where we see plants that were planted in a location and they virtually outgrew their available space. The next, and when we're thinking about this, is the plant type. Do I want a shade tree? Do I want an ornamental flowering tree, an evergreen tree, a broadleafed evergreen shrub, deciduous shrub, herbaceous perennial, ornamental grass, ground cover, vine? All of these things come into consideration. And again, when we think about the plant type, that usually matches the space that we have available. The other thing to consider when it comes to the plant type is their overall shape. There are a number of different shapes that plants provide. We have broad spreading plants, we have round plants, we have pyramidal plants, upright, narrow, or what we would consider columnar plants. There are arching branches, there are weeping branches, there are mounded, spreading, creeping, all these different shapes that come into play. And so fitting the right plant for its space, we also consider the shape, the overall shape that plant's gonna have. Again, and if the shape doesn't match the space, then we have to consider pruning, and that adds to the maintenance consideration in the selection. Flowers, foliage, fruit, all of these things are going to be a consideration when it comes to the aesthetics. The next thing we'll talk about is site adaptability. And site adaptability comes down to, will your site conditions match the site requirements for the given plant? So we'd like you to hold that thought right now. We're going to take a short break and then come back and we'll continue with site adaptability. So stay tuned for more on Right Plant, Right Place and the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show on News Talk 760 WJR.
Welcome back to more of the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show with your host, Dr. Bob Schutzke.
Welcome back. We're here talking about right plant, right place, and the important factors in selecting plants for your landscape. One thing I'd like to mention, one of the things that's important when knowing how large a plant will grow or what shape it will have, you can do two things. One, if you deal with the attendants at the garden centers that they're shopping at, they should be able to tell you what the mature size of the plant will be, how long it will take to reach that mature size. The other thing is, if you're going and you're doing a shopping expedition and you're just writing down some names, you can go back home and go online and get more information about the plant. One of the best sites you can go to is the Missouri Botanical Garden Plant Finder. They have extensive information on the plants, and usually it's a real good, reliable source for information. But again, it's important to know approximately how big that plant is going to get and how long it's going to take to do that. As a plant designer, what we usually do is try to design and select plants so they reach their semi-mature size in a reasonable period of time. And so you're going to ask me, what's a reasonable period of time? And it's usually anywhere from 5 to 7 years, depending on the type of plant. I would expect my perennials to reach their mature size in the 3rd season. My shrubs, I would like to see them reach their mature size in somewhere between 5 and 7 years. When I say 5 to 7 years, the larger shrubs like viburnums, forsythias, some of the witch hazels, those will take a little bit longer, and so I can expect them to start to mature and really develop into their full form in that 5, 6, 7 year period. Smaller shrubs like spireas and Daravilla, some of the small ground cover shrubs, I would expect them to reach their mature size in 3 to 5 years. Trees, we think of ornamental trees, it's going to be somewhere around 10 years. For shade trees, we're thinking about a semi-mature size in 15 years. And so again, when you're looking at that overall size, how fast does the plant grow? How soon will it reach its mature size? And that'll help you with selecting for the particular space that you have in mind. Okay, we'll go back to site adaptability. We mentioned this right before the break. And so the first thing is the USDA hardiness zone. And Bert Craig and Stacy, they talked about hardiness zones, and most of the plants that are sold in our garden centers or available here to us in Michigan are hardy for our particular hardiness zone. If we think about, generally speaking, our hardiness zones may be hardiness zone 3 to 4 up in the UP. On the lower peninsula and the northern part of the lower peninsula, we often hear that Pellston in Michigan is the coldest part of the state, and that would be zone 4. For those people in the Detroit area, it's zone 5B, 6A. And in the Lansing area, we usually consider it 5A. And then on the west side of the state, along the lakes, we usually consider it 5 to 6. And so the hardiness zone deals with the average, lowest, or coldest temperature in winter. So hardiness zones were usually covered. There are some plants that are considered dieback plants. And what a dieback plant is its stem hardiness, its crown hardiness is not sufficient for the area. However, its root systems are. And so those types of plants, quite typically, if we're using those, we cut the branches back to the crown, back to the soil level each year, and then the plant comes back and usually gives us a really nice shrub. Some of the butterfly bush are considered dieback shrubs. Calocarpa, beautyberry, is considered a dieback shrub. So if you have a plant that just doesn't have that stem hardiness, and each year it gets hit by our cold winter temperatures, basically what we do is prune it back to the ground, and then the root system usually pushes a really nice formed plant. Now, Stacy talked about pruning some of the hydrangeas that are flowering on old season's wood. What flowering on old season's wood means that the flower buds are formed during the summer of the previous season, and those flower buds bloom the following spring. If we have a shrub like that and we prune it back to the ground, we won't have any flowers. So, understanding how the plant flowers will be an important thing as well when it comes to dealing with dieback shrubs. Okay, soil type. We have sand, We have loam and we have clay, and a mixture of each of those. And so when we think about soil type and the adaptability of plants to different soils, there's a few things that we should know. When it comes to clay soils, drainage is the most important factor. Bert Craig mentioned that in his show a couple of weeks ago. When it comes to adding organic matter to clay, the thoughts are if we add organic matter to clay, the organic particles break up the clay colloids, and it usually facilitates drainage. And so that's true, so adding organic matter to clay soils helps. However, there needs to be drainage down below the planting hole, so that if the clay layer is extremely thick or deep, you can loosen up the clay particles with organic matter, but if the water has no place to drain through, then you're basically creating somewhat of a soup bowl. And so when it comes to clay soils, we talk about having plants that are adapted to that, or and we mentioned it slightly a couple weeks ago, you plant a little bit higher. And if you plant a little bit higher, basically you're moving those root systems up above that the bottom of a hole, and hopefully that deals with the drainage. When it comes to loam, it's interesting, a lot of the academic textbooks that we use in plant identification, it says this plant loves moist, well-drained soils, and everybody laughs. And so, yeah, how many places do you plant where you have moist, well-drained soils? So they're either going to be dry or they're going to be wet. But in any event, if you have a loamy soil, good friable soil, good loose soil, that's the best thing we could hope for. When it comes to sandy soils, one of the things that we can do to help sandy soils is to add organic matter. Adding organic matter to sandy soils helps with two things. It helps the organic materials hold nutrients, and they also absorb moisture. So you can increase the water holding capacity and you can increase the nutrient holding capacity if you add organic matter to sandy soils. And basically you would mix the organic matter in with your backfill soils, and if you can dig a little bit wider and a little bit in some cases deeper soil in the hole, then that will help with the development of root systems and the survival of that particular plant. Soil pH is important. Okay, and Bert Craig talked about 6 to 6.5 is considered the ideal soil pH. If we're going to deal with the ericaceous plants, the rhododendrons, the azaleas, blueberries, they like a soil pH of 4.5 to 5. And a lot of us will have soil pHs into the 7.5 range. There are some specific plants that will have pH problems, and your attendant at your local garden center can help you with those particular plants. But as a general rule, we would want that soil pH to be somewhere around 6 to 6.5. If we have low pH soils, we add lime. If we have high pH soils, we could add sulfur to bring it down. But again, adding sulfur to high pH soils, it takes a long while for that to work in the soil reaction and bring those pHs down. We're gonna take another short break, so stay tuned for more PlantMichiganGreen.com gardening show on News Talk 760 WJR. We're here talking about right plant, right place, more specifically with site adaptability, and we'll continue on with our discussion. I'd like to start back with light exposure. When we think about light exposure, we think about full sun, partial shade or full shade. Most horticulturists consider 6 hours of sunlight full sun, and when it drops down to full shade, no direct sunlight at all. It basically, you can see where you're walking, but not much more than that. When it comes to light exposure, there's several plants that in their natural habitat will like full sun. And so in those particular plants, it's important that they get that. For example, for one of the most common plants that we see affected by less than full sun are the junipers. Junipers like full sun, they do well in full sun, and when they're planted in shade, they start to get leggy and they have sparse foliage. There are situations in the landscape where at the original planting, junipers were planted underneath crabapples or some other flowering tree. As the flowering trees develop and cast more shade to the ground, the junipers tend to get leggy, they tend to get sparse, and they lose that full needle appearance. And so there's times in our landscapes where it was acceptable to have two plants in combination when they were planted, but as time progresses and both mature, one may cast enough shade over the other that it kind of loses its ability to be full, to give you the appearance that it wants. And so there may be situations in your landscape where just due to time, you may renovate or recondition your landscape by removing some of those plants that no longer have the light exposure that they need. There are several native plants that are considered understory plants. What an understory plant is that its natural habitat is under the canopy of larger plants. And it could be under the canopy of a tree, it could be under the canopy of a shrub, but those plants prefer a partial or full shade situation. And so sometimes when we plant those plants out in full sun, they don't do well in July and August when the temperatures get hot and it tends to be dry. And so they experience what we call summer droop. And summer droop is where the leaves kind of lose turgor. They kind of look like they're almost wilting. And it basically comes down to those plants prefer partial shade or some relief from full sun, and in order to help that, they tend to need a little bit more water. One of the plants that often comes to mind in that is the flowering dogwood, Cornice florida. It will adapt to full sun, but if we get into that hot, dry weather in the middle of the summer, the leaves tend to go a little bit limp, and they're looking for that relief from shade, because in the natural environment, and Cornice florida is a Michigan native, it is definitely an understory plant, and it's found in the upland hardwood forests. Compass orientation is another important consideration, and so what that means is, where is the plant and how is it susceptible to prevailing winds and winter sun patterns? Okay, prevailing winds for us, it's usually the north and northwest exposures. And so those winds tend to be most harsh in the winter and then can be an issue, especially on our broadleafed evergreens. So if you're looking at hollies, if you're rhododendrons, any of the broadleafed evergreens, when it comes to the prevailing winds, the winds during the winter help actually not help, but cause the leaves to lose moisture. And the moisture that's lost in the leaves cannot be replaced by the root system because of frozen soils. And so what happens is that the leaves desiccate, they start to go off color, and in severe situations, they go brown and then eventually die. There's something that we call winter leaf curl in rhododendrons, and so you may find this on PGM rhododendron. PGM rhododendron is extremely hardy, but still, when we get to some of those prevailing winds in the winter, you may see the leaves start to curl. When they start to curl under, that is because of the moisture loss from the evergreen leaf. And so compass orientation for broadleafed evergreens, we'd like to keep them away from the northwest exposure. Or if we have them on a northwest exposure, we want something in front of them to intercept those winds prior to hitting that particular plant. The next is the winter sun patterns, okay? So the sun rises in the east, sets in the west. In the winter time, the sun is more in the southern portion of the skies, and so the decreased angle of the sun in the winter, the warmest part of the day in wintertime in full sun is usually 3 o'clock in the afternoon, something like that. What happens then is that on thin-barked plants, okay, when I say thin-barked plants, the Japanese maples, in some cases red maple, when the bark heats up in that late afternoon sun, and then the sun sets, there's an abrupt temperature change. So the moisture in the cells in the bark were actually the moisture was liquid in the bark in the late afternoon, and when the sun sets and the temperature drops, that abrupt temperature change causes that moisture to recrystallize, and that's what causes bark splitting. So there's two issues on thin bark plants. One is called sun scald, and the second is bark splitting. Each occur when that bark is subjected to late winter sun. So you may talk about that with your garden center rep as well. If you're thinking about planting in the southwest portion of your property, you want to make sure that the bark of any thin barked plant is protected from that late afternoon winter sun. Okay, the next thing I'd like to talk about is maintenance. When it comes to selecting plants, one of the things I often talk to people about is how much maintenance are you willing to accept? How much maintenance do you have time to perform? Or is maintenance one of your hobbies, landscape maintenance one of your hobbies that you get enjoyment out of? And so you can think about selecting a plant for your landscape, but what does that plant need you to do in subsequent years as it's developing? And so the first thing we usually think about when it comes to maintenance is pruning. How much pruning needs to be done? Is it seasonal pruning? Is it going to be shearing? Is it minimal pruning? Or can the plant be left alone without any particular regular pruning and then just touch-ups when it's needed? And so what type of pruning are you willing to do? Are you able to do? And in some cases, do you have the right tools to do it? The second thing we think about is sanitation. What kind of cleanup is needed throughout the season? Now, there's some plants that actually your sanitation would be required in both summer, fall, and in some cases winter with broken branches. And so what does this plant shed? Is it leaves? Is it fruit? Stems and branches? One of the things that when we were on campus, some of the crabapples were planted close to sidewalks or patios. And when the crabapples fell, they stacked up on the walkways and the patios, and as people walked over them, it causes them to smash, and when they smashed, they attracted yellow jackets and honeybees. And so again, there's certain things that you need to consider in sanitation. Okay, we're going to take another short break and come back. We're more on management or plant maintenance on the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show on News Talk 760 WJR.
Now back to more gardening with your host, Dr. Bob Schutzke, on the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show. Here's Dr. Bob.
Welcome back. We're talking about right plant, right place, and maintenance considerations when selecting plants. And so we talked about, or the last thought we had was on sanitation. And so what kind of cleanup? Is it a deciduous plant? Do I have to rake leaves? Is it an evergreen plant? And do I have to deal with needles? Do I have fruit that becomes a sanitation problem? Is it a plant that sheds its branches in the winter? And because there's some plants that do self-pruning, and so that again will help you figure out how much input do you have to add to this plant during its season. The next is irrigation. Do I have an automatic irrigation system? Okay. If I do, are my zones appropriate for the plants that I'm selecting? And what I mean by that is that quite often we have plants that are planted in turf. Okay, so there's been several situations where I've been called out to help diagnose some problems. And so we found trees, evergreen trees and deciduous trees that are showing signs of water stress. And it turned out that the irrigation system to maintain the turf was more irrigation than was required by the trees. In fact, the trees were being overwatered by the irrigation that was set for the turf. So if you're going to be placing trees or any plant for that matter in turf, make sure that the irrigation system is not going to be set to where what you need to keep the grass green the way you like it will wind up being a problem on the plants. Okay, then the other thing when it comes to the irrigation within the planting beds. Okay, in the old days, people used to say, oh, we're going to segregate the plants based on their water needs. That doesn't work, because when it comes to segregating plants based on water needs, it may not make any sense from a design standpoint. And so we have to consider having the plants in or under enough zones that you can adequately water the plants during the season without overwatering some and underwatering others. The other thing, quite often, we think about trickle irrigation or drip irrigation programs. And so when it comes to watering in the beds, we have trickle or drip, we have spray heads, and we have overhead sprays. And so your irrigation contractor should be able to identify the correct delivery method to adequately water many of your plants. When it comes to some plants, for example, like roses, we don't, and Stacy brought this up, we don't overhead water roses because of black spot and some of the other diseases, and so they're most appropriately watered at the ground level. And so when you think about irrigation, do you have an automatic irrigation system? If you do, will that system be appropriate for the plant that you're trying to introduce into your landscape? If you don't have an automated irrigation system, then it's a matter of making sure that you're able to deliver water to a plant, especially during its establishment period, and take it from there. Fertilization. Most plants find enough nutrients in the soil to grow acceptably. There may be some instances where there's some deficiency in soil that you may have to add, but in many cases, when it comes to our woody plants, our trees and shrubs, our woody ground covers, we may not necessarily have to fertilize on an annual basis, maybe every 2 or every 3 years, based on soil tests. It's important that if you're concerned about nutrition for your landscape, that you take soil tests, because that's what's going to help you to the most extent. And then the last thing we consider in the selection is, does the plant have any regular insect or disease problems? Insects and disease problems that require annual sprays. And so there's a whole bunch of different species out there and cultivars of species that may be slightly more susceptible or slightly less susceptible or more tolerant and or resistant to different insects or disease pests. And the last thing are about rodents. Do I have deer? Do I have rabbits? And do I have to consider selecting plants that are not attractive dinner items or breakfast items for those particular plants? Later on in the season, we're going to have Tom Fernandez from MSU talk about deer-resistant plants. But again, that's something that we need to consider. So if you're interested, if you have any questions on this in terms of plant selection, go to the website, send any of your questions to me, and we'll hopefully get you answers. The other thing, there's a plant selection checklist on the website, the plantmichigangreen.com website, that will take you step by step through these different issues. And so, again, that's it for this week. So don't forget to visit the website and click on Ask the Expert and submit your questions. And tune in every Saturday at 4 p.m. through August for the best information and advice to maximize your outdoor living experience. And during the week, log on to plantmichigangreen.com, your landscaping and horticulture resource. Again, that's all for this week. I'm Dr. Bob, wishing you sunshine and happy gardening. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk again.
You've been listening to the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show with Dr. Bob Schutzke, presented by the Michigan Nursery and Landscape Association.